Hello, I'm Sharon Bradford Franklin, Senior Counsel with the Constitution Project, and I want to welcome you all and thank you for joining us here for today's event. Before we get started, I want to first express our sincere thanks to the firm Latham & Watkins, especially for sharing with us a fabulous team of attorneys who served as what we call our reporters and helping us by doing lots of background research and working with our committee to develop the report we're releasing here today. And I'm really pleased that the core of our team is here in the back of the room, Tyler Nims, Shervin Rezai, and Daniel Adams. So I really want to extend our sincere thanks to them. And also to thank the firm for hosting us here today and providing us with a wonderful lunch. I hope you will all help yourselves to that as well. Now, today, of course, is the 11th anniversary of September 11th, 2001. And I want to first just take a moment to remember and honor those who lost their lives in that terrible tragedy, and as well as their family members and the first responders and everyone whose lives were changed forever on that day. We're here today to discuss a government program that was part of our nation's effort to respond to that tragedy and to design to help prevent future such events. And our goal with the Constitution Project is to make sure that these programs are not only designed to prevent future tragedies, but also designed in a way to preserve our American values and Constitution. So today we are releasing our new report that you hopefully picked up a copy of on your way in, Recommendations for Fusion Centers, Preserving Privacy and Civil Liberties While Protecting Against Crime and Terrorism. And I'm joined here by a wonderful expert panel to discuss the issues we raised in that report. But before I introduce them, I want to give you all a brief overview of the report itself. Now, some of you in the room today are Fusion Center experts and have followed the activities of Fusion Centers for a long time, but others of you may never have heard of Fusion Centers before or even know what one is. So for those of you, I just want to start off by saying Fusion Centers are basically information sharing hubs designed to bring together state, local, and federal law enforcement officials, intelligence officials, and in some cases private sector entities as well. And the goal is to strengthen coordination efforts. And this is something, recommended certainly in the wake of the 9/11 as something that we needed to do. At last count, I understand there are now 77 Fusion Centers operating across the country. And they are not specifically federal entities. They are much more state and local creatures, but the federal government is involved, particularly through the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security. Now, our report focuses particularly on the civil liberties risks raised by Fusion Centers, but I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that the purpose of the centers is certainly a good one, information sharing, and that's something that was recommended very much by the 9/11 Commission. And if done properly, Fusion Centers can hopefully be a valuable tool in our counterterrorism and other law enforcement efforts. This report was developed by the Constitution Project's Bipartisan Liberty and Security Committee. That committee was formed shortly after September 11, 2001, and it brings together people who come from a variety of political perspectives, but also experts who are former officials in all three branches of our government, academics, and a variety of other policy experts on these issues. And they have, over the years, working with us, considered issues ranging from detention policies to government surveillance programs. And so they came together in this instance to look at the issues raised by Fusion Centers. And basically, the committee examined three broad categories of issues that I just want to highlight for you and made recommendations in each one of those three categories. The first is looking at the data collection practices of Fusion Centers. And Fusion Centers, pool a lot of information from a wide variety of sources. And the main risk here that the committee identified is the risk of profiling, racial, religious, and political. And the report includes some accounts of that happening at various Fusion Centers. Again, I want to be clear that this doesn't mean that this profiling conduct is rampant throughout all the Fusion Centers, but there are very real risks that we need to take seriously. And a lot of these come from the new challenges created by the very structure of Fusion Centers and by putting local law enforcement officials into very new and different assignments. The second broad category is data storage and use practices of the fusion centers. The information that's coming into the centers is being put into massive databases, may in many cases be subject to data mining practices, looking through by sophisticated algorithms for patterns, highlighting who should be subject to investigation. So, what are the limits, if any, on what the fusion centers can do with this information, and are there appropriate safeguards in place? The third category is looking at accountability issues. And here we looked at, do fusion centers typically have clear mission statements that focus their efforts? Is there adequate transparency? What kind of redress procedures are available? And what kind of oversight is there of the fusion center's operations? And so in each of the categories, our committee made a series of recommendations. In fact, at the end of the report, you will find 25 specific recommendations. I will not read through all of them right here. You have the report. But just to highlight in each of the categories, in data collection, we urge fusion centers to establish clear guidelines and conduct training to avoid these risks of profiling and ensure that individuals only become the target of investigation when they're engaged in actual behaviors that raise a reasonable suspicion of criminal wrongdoing. And fusion center personnel need to be trained on the constitutional rights of free expression, religion, assembly, and equal protection. In the data storage and use area, we have a series of recommendations, including that fusion centers should strictly limit the information that they collect and use to what is necessary to serve their legitimate law enforcement purposes. In the area of accountability, the committee made recommendations about fusion centers being subject to greater oversight by both federal and state governments. And while we recognize that certainly the very nature of what the fusion centers are set up to do requires a certain amount of confidentiality and secrecy, that still there can be much greater transparency about their actual practices and activities. So with that overview, I'd like to introduce our panelists who are going to help focus us better from their range of experience on the issues before us. I'm really glad that we have such a great range of backgrounds here among our panelists. And you have full bios in your program, but I'm going to just give a little bit of a highlight of that'll focus you on the perspectives they have to offer here today, and I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will be speaking. So first we will have Mary McCarthy, who is actually the one panelist who is a member of our Liberty and Security Committee and worked with us in developing this report here. She is an attorney and consultant on freedom of information and privacy issues, and previously she was a career intelligence official, spending 22 years in intelligence and policy positions, including a special assistant to the president and senior director for intelligence programs on the National Security Council staff. Our next speaker will be Jen Trainum, who is a career detective and served for 27 years with the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department. And the last 19 of these years, he was assigned to the homicide branch. So we have both an intelligence community perspective and a law enforcement perspective. And then our next panelist will be Sameera Hafiz, who is the policy director at the Rights Working Group and leads and coordinates coalition advocacy efforts and strategies to advance their policy goals. She also has worked before in several different organizations promoting immigrant rights policies and will particularly be able to address the data collection practices issues that we raise in the report. And our final speaker will be David Gersten, who is senior executive in the Department of Homeland Security, serving as the director of the Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Program Branch in the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. And his responsibilities in that office include that he has worked closely with DHS's Office of Intelligence and Analysis and its Privacy Office to provide on-site civil liberties training to fusion centers. But I did promise David that we would not present him as accountable or responsible as DHS for the fusion centers generally. That is not his jurisdiction or responsibility, but he can provide that perspective for us. So I'm going to turn this over now to Mary McCarthy to get us started.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. Just note that there are 25 recommendations in this report. This is a 23-page report. I think that speaks volumes in itself. Usually when you're putting a report like this together, you try to limit the number of recommendations that you make in order to have them be as pointed and have as much impact as possible. However, there were actually 25 different areas that we felt needed fixing. And keep in mind that this is just in terms of the constitutional issues and the security issues. It really does not speak to any of the operational issues, the effectiveness and so on of fusion centers. But let me just begin by saying that fusion centers are a good thing. They've been around for really a long time. Military commands have had fusion centers, and in my experience in visiting them over the years, they were the most vibrant and exciting places to be in the command. They brought all of the intelligence together, both not at the national level and the tactical level, and they had well-trained people, and they had great equipment, and they had great space. So my view of the fusion center is that it should be, can be and should be a very exciting, very effective place where business is carried on in a way that safeguards our liberties as well as our security. Various investigations after the September 11th attack indicated that information sharing amongst the top-level agencies of the federal government was in part at fault for not bringing together the information and being able to prevent or at least warn more clearly of the kind of attack that was looming. In particular, the 9/11 Commission recommended the establishment of an information sharing environment. So ISE, or information sharing environment, now has become kind of the paradigm for counterterrorism activities. I worked on the Markle Foundation reports, the first three, and they were very well received and actually identified the idea of the information sharing environment and how to do it. And this was adopted in various pieces of legislation and in regulations, and so now we really have this idea enshrined in our national legal framework. The idea is to share information not only among federal agencies, but also state, local, tribal agencies, and even the private sector. So that meant strengthening these centers, which had existed before for various particular reasons, you know, gambling, interstate gambling, or organized crime, or whatever. But now the state entities and local entities were going to be offered copious amounts of federal funding. So what's not to dislike when that comes along? Now, what do you do when you're just a little startup entity and you're given a bunch of money? What do you spend it on? You spend it on staff and you spend it on technology. So therein lies my first two issues that I want to talk about. And I'm only going to take a few minutes to talk about this. There's lots of other stuff, but I just want to point out the two issues that I think kind of are the most salient here in this report. Staff have to be trained. You can't, anybody who has ever worked in this business of intelligence analysis knows you can't just pull a guy or gal off the street, sit him on a desk and tell him, hey, read this and put this all together and tell me what it all means and try to give me a little analytic forecast here of where we're going and try to tell me what else we need to collect. You have to train people to do this. And this now has loomed as a major issue. Smart people sitting in desks, they need to be trained. The training has been less than quality training that most of these folks have received. In tracking the training that Fusion Center staffs are getting, there have been a couple reports out that have surveyed the training and noted that trainers are really not very much in command of their subject matter, and they're even less in command of the constitutional issues that loom when information is collected on our own citizens. So that would be the first point that I would want to make, is that in terms of our recommendations, the staff have to be trained to work in accordance with the law and with guidance and policies that come up both from the state level and the federal level. And it requires some sophistication on the part of the trainers, and they have to help the staff navigate through what are sometimes nuanced rules. They're not always black and white. They have to be able to train staff and their managers to give them the confidence to be able to understand the nuances and which side of perhaps that borderline they need to fall on. The second area I want to talk about, just in my introductory remarks here, is collection, technology, and storage. There is a nice Code of Federal Regulations, Section 28 CFR Part 23, that prohibits law enforcement agencies that receive federal funding, i.e. the state fusion centers, from collecting or maintaining personal information about individuals in criminal intelligence databases unless there is a reasonable suspicion that the individual is involved in criminal conduct and the information is relevant to that criminal conduct or activity. So remember I said that one of the things we spend our money on is technology. So we buy computers, we establish databases, we get all kinds of software, we dump information into them. So there they are, there it is. Does it violate 28 CFR Part 23? Possibly, but a really keen eye and a trained eye has to look at that information and know whether that's true or not. Beyond that, let me just say also that the reasonable suspicion standard requires that the law enforcement official that's gathering that data has to be aware that that information gives him a basis to believe there is a reasonable possibility that the individual is involved in a definable criminal activity. It can't be just something that this looks kind of bad, this doesn't smell quite right. But now along comes something called the Suspicious Activity Report. And this is now a standard animal, and it isn't really anything other than what the cop on the beat might see, could be very valuable, or, see it, report it kind of thing, where the citizen reports suspicious activity. That guy who moved in the house across the street from me, he's doing something funny, he's bringing lots of boxes in the house. Well, yeah, he's moving. But, is that going into the databases, and then is that permissible? Fusion centers, in addition, often issue bulletins for other fusion centers to follow up on some of these reports. Those bulletins go into those databases as well. How long do they stay there? Indefinitely. Our report recommends that an audit be done on databases at least every 5 years, and that information that is no longer salient or has no reason to be there in support of an investigation, that be removed. There should also be tracking activity to see how the databases are used. We have to ensure that when data mining occurs, that constitutional protections are applied. I'm going to assume you know what data mining is, but if not, we can talk about it later. And then finally, private sector partnerships are really important, but fusion centers should be careful that personally identifiable information that is attached to any report not be shared with the private sector unless it is for a genuine law enforcement and necessary for a law enforcement or national security purpose. I would just close by saying that two of the areas in which that we have highlighted in the report are oversight and accountability, and I hope that the discussion and some of the Q&A following our presentations will focus on those areas. Thank you.
Thank you. One thing about law enforcement is that we've never played well together, not only when it comes to agency interaction, but even when it comes to sharing information within the same agency. A prominent defense attorney once told me that if my department ever got together and just shared the information that we all had, then crime would be non-existent in D.C. That is why I really welcome the concept of a fusion center. I don't know how many times I would have loved to have had a central unit that I could have turned to and searched for intelligence when it came to my suspects and criminal gangs that were named in my cases. But fusion centers really face a tough challenge. How do you triage the excess of information, package it in a usable form, and then act on it without impacting the rights and freedoms that we all enjoy? The very nature of our democracy means that we will always be vulnerable. Eventually, we will fall victim to another attack. And when that happens, we will first look to the fusion center. Who knew what, when, and what actions were taken? And then heads are going to roll. I've seen this fear of blame behind many questionable decisions by law enforcement, combined with tunnel vision, groupthink, and the other cognitive and personal biases that we all bring to the table. It is what is behind many failed investigations and civil rights abuses by law enforcement. It also creates an atmosphere where individual decision-making is hampered, leading to the inability of analysts to effectively and intelligently sort through the chaff in order to deal with the grain. This directly impacts the ability of those tasked with the follow-up work, as well as the quality of the intelligence reports coming from the center. The inability to effectively deal with excessive noise on the intake side often results in crap coming across the end user's desk. Many who would benefit from a Fusion Center's output soon come to ignore it. And it's not that the personnel who are assigned to Fusion Centers are anything but intelligent and dedicated. Often they just don't have the training and the background. Many centers are populated by active or retired law enforcement officers. And I know from personal experience that street law enforcement takes a very different skill and mindset than is required by intelligence analysts. Shoot, for the most part, I haven't even heard of the 28 CFR during most of my career. I had no idea what it was, okay? The staffing and supervision of Fusion Centers by trained career intelligence analysts and officials is crucial to quality information processing and the prevention of abuse. In addition to that and the other recommendations that were made by the Constitution Project, I would like to add one that is being made for the criminal investigation side to help stop or at least prevent investigative failures. The primary one is the routine use of devil's advocates. It's not the evidence or the information that causes the problems, but its interpretation. Devil's advocates are encouraged to challenge and test both the interpretation and the proposed actions to be taken at all levels of the process. Their challenges would do much to help counter the groupthink and the false moral identity that can be found behind many of the problems that have been linked with Fusion Centers. And I just have a personal story where I saw this in action. It was many years ago. I was assigned to a satellite intelligence center that was monitoring the activities of undercover officers that were being used in a series of protests that were being held here in D.C. These undercover officers had been embedded in these various protest groups for many, many months. The fact that they were spending that amount of money and resources on that they would never have spent on a criminal investigation is another topic that I don't want to get into right now, but it's a matter in itself. One of the groups we were notified by the undercover officer was using two-way radios to coordinate their activities, and they had a base station set up. And they were in the process of moving that base station from one location to the other. Well, we began to come up with plans. Okay, how do we intercept that base station? What kind of ruses can we use to take that base station away from them? Even though we had no information that they were involved in criminal activities, they were on the other side. They were the protesters. They were the ones that we were trying to control. And we were coming up with these ruses and plans and all that, and then somebody said, hey, wait a minute, isn't that illegal? And it was like a balloon popped. And we all kind of said, well, we all kind of started to backstep away from it. And what we did there was that one question, that one person playing the devil's advocate, allowed us to dodge a bullet. Not only did it prevent us from violating somebody's civil rights, but it kept other things from happening as well. I've done a lot of work in the area of police reform. And when I go to my bosses, when I go to other police officials sometimes, and I start talking about different things that they can do to help prevent wrongful convictions, help prevent false confessions, they kind of roll their eyes a little bit, and they go, yeah, well, that's nice and all that. The key word is liability for them. You start talking liability, and that's what really catches their attention. Because when reforms come up like this, and they might go, well, that's a civil rights issue, we can work around that. Once they're hit in the liability area, that's when reforms start getting forced down their throat. And usually those reforms are a lot more severe than the ones that are being proposed here today. Thanks.
Hello. I just wanted to start by thanking Sharon and the Constitution Project for inviting me to speak on this panel today, and moreover for issuing this very important report that sheds light on fusion centers and offers several very important recommendations on how they can be improved. I also wanted to reiterate what Sharon said and remember that today is the 11th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, and remember the victims and families from that day. And also take it as an opportunity to reflect on how our government policies have changed as a response and result of those attacks. Some examples of that are the enactment of the Patriot Act and broadened surveillance powers of the government, increased immigration enforcement initiatives that have blurred the lines between state and local policing and federal immigration authority, the militarization of our borders, and increased information sharing embodied in things like fusion centers. Rights Working Group, where I work, was formed in the aftermath of 9/11 as several groups got together concerned about some of these policies and the way that we were losing some of our civil liberties and civil rights. Currently, Rights Working Group has about 300 members throughout the country in several different sectors: immigrant rights, national security, human rights, and members of the Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian populations. We currently lead a campaign to end racial profiling, and our members are concerned about fusion centers, and they have many questions. Some of the questions are as basic as, what are fusion centers? There is a real lack of education and knowledge amongst the community and people that are probably feeding into the fusion centers and have their information within them. There's a gap in how much they know about them and what's being collected on them and what's going on. Some other questions that are out there are, where are the fusion centers? Where are they located? Who works there? What private sector entities share and exchange information with these fusion centers? What if this information on me is incorrect? How can I correct it? How can I find out if there's any information on me? What are the benefits of fusion centers? How have they resulted in law enforcement advances? So I think one of the concerns is translatable and accessible information for communities to really understand what fusion centers are doing and what they're doing to make sure that racial and religious profiling is not taking place. The Constitution Project's report offers important recommendations to address racial profiling. They suggest guidelines that would prohibit racial profiling and suggest a standard of reasonable suspicion for law enforcement to go forward with information. They also suggest training for fusion center personnel on constitutional rights and training and making sure that fusion center personnel instructors are competent and well qualified. And just to address some of those recommendations, the report does a great list examples of some of the fusion center instructors and making sure that they are competent. And some of the fusion center instructors that we've heard reports of actually have expressed bias and bigotry, Islamophobic ideas to the people that they've trained at fusion centers. There's an example of that in the report. We've heard other examples where instructors have talked about how all Muslims should be surveilled because they all want to impose Sharia law in the United States, and other incorrect information such as that. So that is a really key recommendation. It's also important for any guidelines to have teeth, to make sure that there's accountability and enforceability and clear procedures for people to file complaints and make sure that they're accessible. And also, as far as the reasonable suspicion standard goes, in many cases for communities of color that are targeted by law enforcement, that standard continues to be problematic. Some examples, that we've seen are with the New York Police Department. There's been a lot of media attention around their stop and frisk policies, which use a similar standard and result in the overwhelmingly disproportionate targeting of Blacks and Latinos. Similar policies that use a reasonable suspicion standard are the immigration policies that states like Arizona's SB 1070 have enacted, where law enforcement, if they have a reasonable suspicion to believe someone is undocumented, can stop them and demand their papers. And what's resulted is the whole-scale rampant racial profiling of Latinos and other communities of color. So this standard is something that we need to be aware of and wary of. Some of the report also does a really great job of talking about suspicious activity reporting and how they feed into fusion centers. Some local initiatives that have identified indicators, suspicious indicators, are kind of startling in their innocuousness. So, for example, a couple of them have listed squinting, panting, rubbing hands, touching the face repeatedly, fidgeting, things that sometimes people are doing just normally. So one of the people working with Rights Working Group, kind of tongue-in-cheek, recently went to the Boston airport, where you might have heard about recently they have been found to be engaging in rampant racial profiling of several communities of color at the airport there, and she was not a member of one of those targeted communities, and she engaged in a lot of these behaviors. She had a cold, penetrating stare and wide flashbulb eyes, and tried to have a trance-like gaze, and really tried to get attention from the TSA officers, and found that she didn't. She wasn't asked to go to secondary screening or inspection, and it's just an anecdote, but it shows that some behaviors are more suspicious when certain groups are engaging in those behaviors. So I think I will end there. Fusion centers present serious concerns about racial and religious profiling, and they do send some troubling messages to the public. They definitely change our ideas about privacy and what the government can do in secrecy, and also, in a way, ask the public to be suspicious of members of community and view their community with suspicion. And this has come down especially hard for members that have been affected by, or for folks that have been affected by post 9/11 racial and religious profiling. And so it's really important to think about how fusion centers feed into this growing suspicion of certain communities. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me. And I, too, want to recognize the anniversary, the unfortunate anniversary of 9/11. This is my 7th anniversary that I've spent as a member of the Department of Homeland Security, and to this day it remains a very heavy part of my motivation for what I do, and the motivation for hundreds of thousands of other people who work at the department and all of our partners throughout government, the private sector, the public, and many others who've spent a portion of their career now since 9/11 working to prevent another 9/11. Just a little bit more about my experience with fusion centers, so you get a sense of where I'm coming from and what my role has been. I do direct a branch within the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties that focuses heavily on policy formation, engagement with communities, and training. We also do a lot of proactive policy development as well. And in that role, we have a number of sections, including sections that have focused primarily on intelligence and information sharing. We also have a section dedicated to training called the Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Institute. That training function has afforded us the responsibility, as directed under the 9/11 Act, of actually training fusion centers and providing civil rights and civil liberties training in cooperation with the Privacy Office of the Department of Homeland Security. But my experience doesn't end in just directing the branch. I've actually personally visited well over 24 fusion centers and delivered some of the training myself to 15 of them. And that's occurred over the last 5 years. We are are well underway towards continuing to fulfill many of the recommendations in the report here. And part of our experience in actually getting to know Fusion Center personnel by delivering this training, going to the Fusion Center conferences, reviewing intelligence products that are delivered by the Department of Homeland Security to Fusion Centers, which is a new function given to our office just recently in the last few years. And of course, also operating as part of the element within the Secretary's office that provides some awareness during crises through the National Operations Center, which is similar to a Fusion Center. All of these have combined to give us a good overview and a good insight into just how Fusion Centers operate and where some of the civil rights and civil liberties concerns may arise. I want to thank the Constitution Project. I think the recommendations are terrific, though I think it relies heavily on, perhaps maybe too heavily on a couple of particular news articles and a small handful of unfortunate products that were released in 2009. Overall, I think it's very well researched, and it's geared towards spreading responsibility and removing some of the mystery surrounding Fusion Centers. And for that, I definitely applaud the Constitution Project. In addition to providing training, our office conducts impact assessments on a regular basis. We conducted one, a preliminary one, for the Fusion Centers back in late 2008, early 2009. And we are very soon going to release a second impact assessment, a much more thorough impact assessment that will go to OMB for interagency clearance within the next week to 10 days. And hopefully, assuming that some of the recommendations survive, we'll be well underway towards actually fulfilling some of the recommendations in your report here. In addition, we have been in the business of providing briefings and testimony to Congress. We've been called up to Congress twice to testify on the subject of Fusion Centers, and I've done a smattering of briefings, including some very interesting briefings where we invited advocacy groups to come and join us at the table and describe the concerns and have an exchange with congressional staff. And then, of course, there's the policy development. Many of the programs, in particular the programs that Sameera mentioned, suspicious activity reporting, screening, things like that, that are not necessarily part of the official Fusion Center program, but touch the Fusion Center program in some way, come across our desk at the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. So we weigh in on the policies and procedures for Fusion Center support, for suspicious activity reporting, for the 287G and secure community agreements that sometimes govern relationships on immigration policy with state and local law enforcement, and even some other types of programs that you might not think of as having any tie to Fusion Center, but the policy for providing CCTV cameras and guidance that we can offer to state and locals for their use of CCTV cameras and other technology. Now, back to some of the recommendations, there's a heavy emphasis on training, and so I thought I'd give you our viewpoint on whether or not we think training is sufficient. Certainly, training is headed in the right direction. And our office has been very focused on actually doing hands-on training to Fusion Centers, not just providing a website, which we do, not just doing training of trainers events for the Fusion Center officers, which we do, but actually getting into the classroom and going around to Fusion Centers on a regular basis. And to date, we've trained 47 of the 77 Fusion Centers that are recognized by governors. And 69 of the 77 have actually trained at our training of trainers events. The chronology of increased protection of rights and liberties in Fusion Centers is a strong success story. And it's involved numerous DHS offices and state and local partners. And I think that along with the actual privacy policies that the privacy office at DHS was instrumental in helping Fusion Centers author and publish, I think we're well underway to creating a climate of respect for rights and liberties. That's not to say that the work is over. For instance, those policies that I mentioned, the 77 approved policies, not all of them are easy to find on the internet. Most of them are. In fact, there's a trade association for fusion centers that has published them online. There are also links to some of the policies from the Department of Justice Justice Programs website, the IJP website. And that said, ensuring that the policies are followed should not just be publishing them and making sure that the public is aware of them. They actually have to have guidance documents and training to ensure that they're being followed. Overall, oversight for fusion centers has, again, as I mentioned, the chronology is over time has demonstrated some improvements in this area. Besides the DHS Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties and the Privacy Office, there are other offices that have paid close attention to fusion centers. Throughout the interagency, there have been many meetings on fusion centers at very significant levels. The program manager for the information sharing environment focuses heavily on fusion centers. If you take a look at the reports that are issued by that office, the PMISC office, you'll see that fusion centers are almost always mentioned, and some of the improvements of respect for privacy and civil liberties are noted. In addition, you have as I mentioned, the Trade Association and the OJP Privacy and Liberty Portal, which has a number of the training, approved training devices and tools that our offices have worked on over the years. And then, of course, you have many of those other types of programs that Sameera mentioned have their own structures for providing respect for rights and liberties. So the National SAR Initiative, for instance, is reviewed regularly by the Department of Justice Privacy and Civil Liberties Office. In addition, the intelligence community has a number of privacy and civil liberties offices that provide some oversight. So overall, oversight has certainly moved in the right direction. There are also toolkits. The Privacy and Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Compliance Verification for Intelligence Enterprise is a self-assessment tool that the Global Justice for Information Sharing Initiative has provided so that fusion centers can check to see whether or not they are complying with all of the elements of their privacy provisions. We also have law enforcement guidelines for First Amendment protected activities. There's a privacy line officers video. There are a number of different types of tools that are available. And again, going back to what I've mentioned in terms of chronology, we're seeing just in the last year the emergence of an actual emphasis in postgraduate work on privacy and civil liberties in fusion centers. The Naval Postgraduate School now has a Fusion Centers Leaders Program. They actually have a member of the audience here attend and give a lecture at that program. I myself, in a predecessor program for the Naval Postgraduate School that wasn't primarily focused on fusion centers, but did touch on the subject of fusion centers, went out to the MPS to give training to future leaders of fusion centers. So as you can tell, there is a lot out there that isn't necessarily well known about what the federal government is doing to protect rights and liberties in fusion centers. One big announcement I wanted to make today is that with cooperation from the Office of Intelligence and Analysis at DHS and the Privacy Office, our office will host a conference on November 14th and 15th for privacy officers, the privacy personnel actually from the fusion centers. We're going to bring them to Nashville, Tennessee, and discuss give a refresher for much of our training, but also discuss the specific recommendations of this report. And I'm pleased to announce that we're going to be inviting the Constitution Project, Sharon Bradford, to come out, and hopefully she'll accept that invitation and actually provide a direct session with the privacy officers so they can see and hear firsthand about these recommendations and how they were formed. Some other quick thoughts. I could go through one by one about the specific recommendations and talk about where some of them have already been fulfilled. I mean, some of them are, it kind of depends on how you would phrase fulfillment, but for instance, just the very last one, Congress, DHS, and DOJ should commission an independent study. There have been actually GAO studies, and one in particular was commissioned to examine the privacy and civil rights and civil liberties considerations in fusion centers. But I want to close by just giving you some examples, some of my firsthand experience on working with fusion centers. I thought it was very interesting that Sameera mentioned we don't necessarily know where the fusion centers are, and I looked back behind my shoulder and saw the map of what might be fusion centers, although I think that's a relatively generic map of just connecting the dots across the country. And you notice Alaska is not on the map. I've been to the Alaska Fusion Center, and I can tell you that it's it has a number of very interesting novel issues that you don't necessarily see at other fusion centers. They're dealing with outlaw motorcycle gangs. They're dealing with personnel at airports, and considering that airports in Alaska, the common mode of transportation is airports, so they have more issues of vetting personnel in Alaska, and the Fusion Center sometimes gets involved in trying to at least provide support and awareness briefings to TSA and to ICE CVIS, this student verification program there. In addition, the Alaska Fusion Center deals with port security. There are more sovereign citizens per capita, perhaps. I don't know if this is an actual number, but I certainly got the sense from hearing from the Fusion Center personnel there that they deal with sovereign citizen issues more in Alaska than in other states. So my point in mentioning this is that just because you conceive of a fusion center as a typical ops center dealing with counterterrorism issues, you might find that most of the issues that a particular fusion center deals with have only a tangential impact on counterterrorism. It's really all crimes, all hazards. Likewise, if you go down to the southwest border, you're going to find that those fusion centers along the border may have ICE personnel who are there to provide some conduit to secure communities and 287G programs, or perhaps just they find that that's a better location to have their direct relationships with state and local law enforcement. And then I'd close by mentioning that the first two centers that I visited were the Maryland Center, the MCAC, and the JRIC, the Joint Regional Intelligence Center, way back in 2007. And it was really striking. And Mary mentioned to start us off that they spend their money, these fusion centers, on personnel and technology. And I just close by saying that it's not always at the same ratio. If you go to the MCAC, when I first went there, it was practically a broom closet. It was a very small room, very limited technology, old, out-of-date computers, but with a lot of staff. Quite a few people coming in and out, not necessarily using the center as their home base, but coming there to have meetings and exchange information and move on. And we noticed from our very first conversations that they were heavily focused on the personnel and training them to have cultural competency, to have some awareness of what different cultures are like, so that their personnel in the field that they provide reports for are not in the business of profiling. I go to the JRIC a month later, and they're in rooms much larger than this with television screens even larger than these, some of them touch screen, and this was many years ago, and linked to all sorts of different databases, and yet they had over 50 empty chairs in the room. The personnel was sparse, but the technology was there. The issues they wanted to talk to us about concerned retention of data, minimization, what they can and cannot do with some of the information that they were receiving. So our office has been heavily involved in this, and I'm really pleased that the Constitution Project has engaged us on this, and I look forward to some questions.
Thank you, and I want to thank David for that invitation, and I hope we can make that work out. So before I open this up for questions from the audience, I just want to get us started here. I have a few questions for our panelists myself, and I'm going to go back through them in the order in which they already spoke. So starting with Mary McCarthy, you mentioned in closing that you hoped we would be talking more about accountability, oversight, and transparency. And I know you know from your experience in the intelligence field that a certain amount of secrecy goes with the territory. You know, not everything can be out in the open when we're having law enforcement and intelligence investigations. But in what ways would you say that fusion centers can actually increase their transparency without undermining their missions?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think really a lot can be out in the open. I mean, clearly you don't want to publish the data. You don't want to necessarily publish, ongoing investigative material. But a lot about the Fusion Center itself can be made public. And I'm glad David made the point that it isn't just counterterrorism in many cases that these fusion centers are looking at. It's all hazards. It's everything from, cigarette smuggling to hurricanes. So there's a lot out there. And that, I think, plays in the recommendation that we made in the report, and that is that fusion centers should publish a mission statement, and that should be published online or should be made available to the public. What do they do? What do they focus on? What are the criteria under which they evaluate information, and how do those evaluations occur? I think that would be easy to post online. You could make it very specific in terms of the mission, but you don't have to make it very specific in terms of investigative techniques and methodologies. And then the other big issue that I am particularly interested in is the whole transparency issue. And the movement at the federal level within state legislatures to try to get state legislators to pass laws that fusion centers are somehow above any kind of government sunshine laws or freedom of information state laws. And this has actually been successful to an extent in a couple states. And this is crazy. I mean, we can protect investigative material very easily under the Federal Freedom of Information Act, and I'm sure that state law, if it does not now protect investigative material, can do so. We also protect private information as investigative personal information under Federal Freedom of Information Act statute, and we could do the same thing under state law if it doesn't already exist. But transparency is extremely important, and it is important for individuals to be able to go to the Fusion Center and ask for information about themselves. They may not get it if it's an ongoing investigation. That's understandable. If the investigation is over with and there's still material about them in their files themselves, then that information should be retrievable. And Sameera also already addressed the issue of redress, which is extremely important. But, above and beyond the help that the federal government is giving the fusion centers, and it sounds like a very robust activity and very skilled activity, I guess I go along with the old adage of, the Reagan quotation of the Russian proverb, trust but verify. We'd like to see some oversight, and state governments have a tremendous responsibility here for oversight. State governments should ensure that the centers are subject to their own privacy and open government laws, and they should require periodic audits to see where the tracks lead within the databases, to see who has been looking for what information. The federal government, because they provide money, they really have a great responsibility as well. And they should also require audits, and particularly they should require an audit for compliance with federal privacy regulations. Congress should make findings to Congress and the jurisdictions in which the Fusion Center exists. And moreover, federal funding should be contingent on state legislation that subjects the fusion centers to state audits. They should not get money if they're not willing to do that. And the federal government should provide the training, which David has now described to us, which is very encouraging.
Thank you. Okay, so for Trainum, you talked a bit about the impetus and the mindset to collect everything and the fear of blame when the next attack would occur. And we've talked a lot in our report about the risks that this collect everything mentality can have for civil rights and civil liberties. And I'm wondering if you could speak to whether you think that reining in that gut instinct and trying to narrow what you collect can have a beneficial effect for the effectiveness as well as helping on civil liberties.
Well, absolutely. It's like in any sort of major criminal investigation, you might get hundreds, if not thousands of tips, but you only have X number of investigators who can run those things down. So you need to prioritize what your investigators do based on the quality of those tips. And a lot of it depends on the person who's doing the intake. If they have access to the person who's given the information, they can be trained as to certain questions that they can ask to help, maybe bring out more information about the tip. As you recognize the pissed off girlfriend who wants her boyfriend investigated, or the pissed off neighbor, that sort of thing. But also they need to look for specialized knowledge, things that would set off red flags. And those are the tips that you may want to spend more energy on. I know that the FBI is doing some major research right now on active shooters. The Columbine type incident, the theater type incident, and they're finding out things, certain behaviors that these shooters engage in beforehand that aren't intuitive. And by training the call takers, training the analysts in these behaviors, that's the specialized knowledge. So you're looking to see, does the caller have some sort of specialized knowledge that will help trigger further investigation? That's not to say that you need to discount the other information that's coming in and of itself, because unfortunately, somebody may call in with a little nugget here, and if you disregard it and discard it, suddenly 2 weeks later, somebody else calls in with a little nugget here, and those two can connect. But what you do with those nuggets in the meantime and how long you keep them, that's a matter of policy that we need to restrict and be careful with. Or, like I said, you just get overwhelmed with the noise and you end up spinning your wheels and not really focusing your resources where they need to be.
Thank you. Okay, so for Sameera Hafiz, the problems that you focused on a lot with the racial and religious profiling, and frankly with political profiling as well, which we also raise in the report, these are not new concerns or certainly unique to fusion centers, but I'm wondering if you can speak to whether there's anything in particular about fusion centers or their databases that either changes the nature of the risk or calls for any kind of particular unique response.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, a lot of this kind of profiling, it's not new. It's been going on for a long time, and I think that what is concerning about fusion centers that raises new concerns are, I guess from the public standpoint, just a lack of understanding of really what's going on and the extent to which information is being collected and how it's being used. So kind of the secrecy. And with the advances in technology, the way that this information can spread and be used is something, I think, newer than what we've seen in the past. And the way that the suspicious activity reporting feeds in, how the biases of the public are also now part of the system that is going into this kind of tracking. I think those are some new concerns that are raised by these centers.
Thank you. Okay, and so for David Gersten, I welcome a lot of the things you told us about the enhanced training efforts and the number of centers that DHS is actually getting out to and training. But there are also some other policies even that we have mentioned in the report that are good, that the requirement of conditioning the grant funding on demonstrating that there is a privacy policy in place. But sort of picking up on that and Mary McCarthy's statement of trust but verify and having audits, DHS is obviously in a somewhat difficult position in that the fusion centers are not purely federal agencies, but there's a lot of federal funding involved in what your relationship is. But to what extent can, should, will DHS have some kind of audit function to sort of make sure that this training is sticking, that some of these privacy policies that are being written are being followed, that angle?
Well, I have a very good short answer, and that is the Fusion Center Assessment Program, which is run by the Office of Intelligence and Analysis. This program started a couple of years ago, and we're now into our second year of collecting data from Fusion Centers through INA. They've also afforded the Privacy Office and the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties with a means for providing questions for the assessment and analyzing the data. So, for instance, one of the recommendations that Mary mentioned or highlighted was whether or not mission statements are transparent. Through the annual Fusion Center Assessment Program, DHS tracks and collects mission statements for all Fusion Centers. On the second recommendation in the report, as a component of the assessment program, DHS tracks which mechanisms Fusion Centers use for engagement and how they conduct their local outreach. This assessment program tracks which privacy policies are publicly available. So there's a number of kind of audit functions of the assessment program. I've already started to speak with the Office of Intelligence and Analysis about some of the recommendations, and they seem to be certainly very open to making more of that assessment program public. So I think that's certainly an area for improvement that will come from your recommendations.
Thank you. Okay, so I would like to open this up to questions from the audience. If you do have a question, if you would please identify yourself and please actually ask a question. Do we have a microphone? No, we don't. Okay. What can be done about targeting? Okay. Does anyone want to talk about reforms for specialized targeting?
I suppose this would come to the only member of the panel is currently in government. I will say that our office, if you believe that you have been targeted wrongfully by an agency involved in the Department of Homeland Security, then you should contact our office. We have a mechanism for review of accusations that leads to an investigation and recommendations to whatever agency may have been involved. If it's not a DHS agency, if it's not Customs and Border Patrol or ICE or TSA or one of the other DHS entities, then we could hand it off to the Department of Justice. I would say that we do occasionally receive complaints from the public, general concerns for potential surveillance. They saw a car that had a DHS logo pass by their house or something to that effect, and we generally do look into it, although I must say that in most instances we need to have some real specifics. It can't be just a general notion that they're being watched. So with real specifics, we can actually get to the bottom of it. Other questions?
Over here.
Eli Lake, Newsweek and Daily Beast. Can you talk about how Fusion Centers, or the line between collecting and observing and monitoring social media, which people voluntarily, I guess, place on the internet, and when that crosses into some sort of breach of privacy? Because it's extremely unclear from this journalist's perspective, as to the difference between
I'll take an initial stab at some of the things that we've talked about generally. Is there's the difference between social media, what somebody is putting out to the general public that any member of the general public could get, or what somebody is trying to keep personal. So if I, on my Facebook profile, limit certain information to my friends, and you, member of the media or police officer, are not one of my Facebook friends, you shouldn't be able to see it and shouldn't be able to go through surreptitious means to get it. You would need reasonable suspicion and so forth and follow those procedures. But if something's out there in the general public, then that would be, something that's certainly fair game for media or law enforcement as members of the general public. But I don't know if...
Law enforcement would be different categories here, right? I mean, who cares if media, if I get a hold of your Facebook posts as a media person, that's one thing. But if someone in law enforcement does, then am I potentially part of some investigation? And wouldn't it raise different questions?
Well, again, there's a distinction between what you're monitoring and what you're putting in a file, and when you have a trigger to put something in a file. So if you see me engaging in things I'm putting out to the public as a general protected matter, versus, but I shouldn't be dominating. Let the panelists take a stab at this.
Well, I do know on the criminal side, I've worked with several analysts who do a lot of work monitoring social media, and this might be too general, but they're not going to waste their time unless they have a specific target that they're looking for, just because their resources are limited as well. If they're going to get into somebody's Facebook, into the privacy side, typically they'll try to do it by court order. And that's something I have no problems with. Search warrants, court orders, things like that is just another level in the checks and balances that keeps me on the straight and narrow.
Maybe yes. Maybe in terms of the fusion centers, and this isn't so much social media, although in part social media, but I'm thinking also of other proprietary databases that are private, like rental car records, credit reports, that kind of thing. Fusion centers, in fact, do collect that kind of information, personally identifiable information that is stored. So that's another area of concern.
Jamana?
I think that comes down to good training and good triage and the ability to make a decision that we are not going to follow up on this lead because A, B, and C. A lot of times what happens is, like I said, I've seen in law enforcement, people in positions of responsibility are fearful of not following up on something because it may come back later on and basically bite them where. But if you're able to come up with criteria and training and say, okay, this lead hits certain red flags and we are going to follow it because A, B, C, and D. Like I said, you have to be able to articulate why you're going to run that lead down. And that's part of triage. And with triage, you're going to miss some good leads. You just can't avoid that. But like I said, it's through training, good supervision, and also, like I say, having somebody playing the devil's advocate to make sure that we're not running off based on an assumption or a bias of some sort. That's about the best answer I can give there.
I think I never know. I think the answer is yes, but also, unfortunately, no. You know, we used to say, oh, yeah, the government has also all this information on me, but, you know, the right hand never knows what the left hand is doing, and they can't communicate, and, you know, it's okay because they just can't get their act together. Well, now increasingly we have software and algorithms that kind of help put the picture together, sometimes in a misleading way. Nonetheless, it's there. So if we do have these bits and pieces that go in to the database, they can be collected together and a story can be made out of them, even if the story makes no sense. The story makes sense to the algorithm, perhaps, but not to us. So it strikes me that what we're working toward here a little bit is kind of the old DARPA total information awareness thing that's kind of on a much smaller scale and a much more localized scale. So that's and again, it's not altogether a bad thing. We want information to come together. We want to understand threats. We may not want to understand, you know, everybody's personal information who's a hurricane victim or something like that. But in the counterterrorism, national security context, I think we want that. But what we want at the same time are safeguards and audits to make sure that this is being done in a constitutional manner.
So, Jamada, I think you kind of raised two different issues there. One is the issue of redress in general. And I would say that at least on the federal side, our complaint process is a form of redress. We would examine whether or not, from a federal standpoint, what a fusion center has done with federal dollars is proper, and whether or not there were any DHS personnel involved in whatever was alleged. We have received some complaints on fusion centers. They've basically broken down into two categories. One were products that had perhaps unfortunate language that described an intent to look at First Amendment protected activities or that examined particular groups of people in a discriminatory manner. And the second category, which is the more recent type of complaint that we've received, involves what type of training fusion centers are receiving. And that is actually described very well in the report here, whether or not there is proper cultural competency training afforded to fusion centers. But then to your second point about suspicious activity reports and how they're used and what kind of climate we're creating. And I would just, kind of, for those of you who are not really familiar with how suspicious activity reports are used, I basically break it down into four categories, at least from the state and local perspective. There's basically four different ways that a fusion center might use a suspicious activity report as opposed to, say, a lead on an already active investigation. A SAR may come in, and if it involves critical infrastructure, the fusion center may pick up the phone and call that particular location and essentially try and harden the target and say, we got a suspicious activity report of somebody driving back and forth repeatedly in front of this nuclear facility. We've looked up the tags from the surveillance camera, and the person is named, Joe Smith. Next time he comes by, stop him and let him know that you're watching. And essentially what you've done is you have created a target that seems a little bit harder for a person who might be up to no good to attack. So that's one model. Another model is they might run the suspicious activity report against any current investigations or hand it to the attorney's office for whatever local jurisdiction might be involved and say, is this something that you actually want to investigate? Pretty rare, I'll tell you. I mean, if every suspicious activity report was handed off for potential investigation, there would be a flood. I mean, there isn't the bandwidth to do that. And then the third and fourth are kind of coupled together. One is to take a look at that suspicious activity report, punch it into the algorithms that Mary was mentioning, and see what comes up, see if it might be tied to something else, and essentially connect the dots. And then the fourth is save it for later. Put it into a database, try and minimize it so that there isn't a violation of 28 CFR Part 23. Make sure that whatever data is retained meets with the standards set by the National SAR Initiative, so that if it is passed on and put into the as an NSI SAR, National SAR Initiative SAR, into a larger federal database, that it doesn't retain information that in and of itself would be discriminatory. We're not just looking at people who are of a certain ethnicity and putting all of those SARs into a database to run an algorithm that we've already decided is going to be based on ethnicity. It's just not the way that it works. And we've done a lot of work to try and ensure that doesn't happen. So those are the kind of the four ways that SARs are used, and you can kind of get a sense just from that, just where some of the rights and liberties concerns might come up.
And can I think just to speak to that question also, one thing that we could challenge the premise that fusion centers are a good thing and they're effective is, what is some publicly available information on how they have been useful, what has resulted from fusion center information, and how has it improved law enforcement? And I think that's a difficult question to answer sometimes.
Mike?
My name is Mike Sherman. I'm with the ACLU, and I have a question for David. Looking back at the training with the Islamophobic training that was pervasive throughout government, it wasn't just the DHS-funded training. The ACLU released tons of documents about FBI training. So this was a pervasive part of counterterrorism training throughout the government. And yet the internal sorts of compliance you're talking about didn't work. It was only when it came out to the public that there was any effort to actually bring that in. So it's great, and we've worked together a long time. That the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties has done a lot, but to go and give an hour's worth of training on civil liberties that's then followed up with 6 hours of these Islamophobic trainings from Joint Terrorism Task Force personnel and DHS and the FBI. It sort of makes the ability lower unless there's some mechanism to actually govern across the different authorities. And how does that fail? How is that not discovered earlier and treated quicker?
Well, that's a very good question. I do want to correct the notion that it's 1 hour to 6 hours. I think it's more likely 6 hours from us, and I've been there on site where it's gone 8 to 10 hours, and 1 hour from the so-called counterterrorism expert who has an off-the-shelf training that they advertise and then gets picked up by a state and local entity, or perhaps a federal entity occasionally. But more to your question, how could it have happened that we got to the stage where there was training that we wouldn't necessarily approve of? Well, for one, certainly when state and locals obtain training, we can't be in the business of depriving someone of their means of livelihood and advertising that they're a counterterrorism expert. There isn't a certification process per se that we could say to a fusion center or to some other state and local law enforcement entity, you can't obtain training unless you go through a prescribed program. Likewise, at the federal level, there are just so many different entities that don't necessarily even have a common definition of what counterterrorism and countering violent extremism in particular, what CVE training is. And it wasn't until we started to see and discover that there was bad training that we started to put our heads around the problem. And in the last year and a half, we've started to really to coordinate better. The White House plan for the National CVE strategy. That CVE strategy and the strategic implementation plan have a lot to say about CVE training. It directs an interagency effort to coordinate CVE training and make sure that it's done with an eye towards best practices. Our office issued guidance that we released through FEMA, for instance, to grant recipients on best practices for obtaining CVE training, and that those, as again, they're not strict controls. It's not a rulemaking, but it is guidance that we hope will be adhered to. So that's kind of a snapshot of where we're headed on trying to improve the climate for CVE training.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two more questions, and I've been asked to make sure that the questioners speak up, or if people on the sides can't hear me, then maybe I'll have to repeat, but you've had your hand up.
Rosemary Strange, I'm with CURE, a prison advocacy program. My question involves, what about the surveillance of convicted felons who return home?
What's your particular question about surveillance? Is it
how much surveillance is there? I know people who are stopped at airports and, singled out, so I'm sure there's a database.
So is being a convicted felon enough to justify surveillance in a database?
Well, the terrorist screening database, of course, helps to populate the no-fly list, for instance, or the secondary screening lists, the lists that TSA and the Terrorist Screening Center use to determine who receives extra scrutiny when they fly. And it depends on the type of crime, but I would imagine that if someone is a convicted criminal that has been involved in some sort of terrorist activity, they're going to be on that list.
In the fusion centers for anybody who's a convicted felon, are they automatically?
Well, that's a question, I guess, of whether or not individual centers have access to the terrorist screening database and to convicted felon databases. And I would imagine that at the state and local level, depending on the jurisdiction, a fusion center can certainly call up and find out who has a record. If they encounter someone and they punch their name into criminal databases, they're going to determine whether or not somebody has a criminal record. When you have been convicted and of a crime, it's pretty well known that that kind of history travels with you. Whether or not fusion centers use that data improperly and perhaps use it in screening or in encounters, I think it depends on the encounter. If a police officer, and I hope Jim will chime in here too, if a police officer encounters someone at a stop and has reasonable suspicion and they punch the person's name in and they have criminal history, it changes the equation.
And typically, if I just stop you and run your name through, most of the criminal databases out there, like NCIC, will not kick back automatically that you're a convicted felon. It will kick back if you're a sex offender, maybe if you're a member of a gang, that sort of thing. But the fact that you're a convicted felon, or maybe that you're on parole. But in order for me to get your criminal record, typically I have to take it 2 or 3 steps further to find out that you're a convicted criminal.
I have to follow up. So what? So what? So what? The person is a convicted, whatever, one of the incidents you mentioned.
Like a sex offender, that sort of thing.
Let me ask the question. It already served his time, so how does that affect whatever he was stopped for? Running a stop sign, a red light, or whatever?
Well, it's not meant to impact like a traffic offense, things like that. The real purpose, from my understanding, the way the laws were passed, is that a person's being on alert as a registered sex offender would be in case they were stopped near a school or near some place where they should not be. If they have some sort of conditional release on them and they're not supposed to be there and they're stopped there. And I don't think that we're sophisticated enough in our computer technology yet in order for, I'm stopping this person for a traffic violation. They're going to screen this information from me. It's just going to, go to me anyway. So.
Okay, I think we had one final question over here.
Thank you, Sharon. I'm Ben Bawden, and I represent the National Fusion Center Association, which David website, nfcausa.net. That is the association's website. You can get contact information, see a location of all the fusion centers. They've actually published every location and the name. You can get in touch with fusion center directors in any state you want to. And so I guess I don't have a question. I would just say that if any stakeholder has any issues or wants to actually talk to a fusion center director, I would encourage direct outreach. And I think there are a lot of constructive recommendations, and I know it'll be good to engage on them going forward.
And I want to thank Ben for reaching out before this, and we're hoping to follow up certainly with his organization.
Can I just respond to that just a little bit by saying that it's a very healthy development to have an association like NFCA, because some of the federal coordination has been done through conferences, and in the current budget climate, it does not look like, and I hope I'm not breaking any news here, but it doesn't look like we're going to have the kind of large national conferences that we've had in years past for fusion centers. Thank you, GAO. GSA, I mean, GSA. And not to say that they were, places where there was rampant misuse of funds. In fact, I did go to them, and we used them to create learning labs, for instance, on privacy and civil liberties. But it's a very healthy development that there are associations like NFC.
Well, if you'll all join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you for coming. And thank you again to Latham and Watkins.